Hi, Dr. Yass here. I really want to point out why the Yost method is so much more valuable than the MRI or going to medical specialists in the ability to properly identify the tissue eliciting your symptoms. It's very, very important to understand the idea that MRIs can only identify structural variations. Muscular causes can never show up. A muscle in spasm at the back would never show up. A muscle imbalance where your front thigh is stronger than your back thigh and the front thigh has a tendency to shorten, causing its attachment to the kneecap to cause the kneecap to be compressed excessively into the knee joint, which could lead to knee pain. We could look at a strain of your rotator cuff, not a tear. Most tears that are found on MRIs are degenerative in nature. One study showed that in a study of 31 professional baseball pitchers that had absolutely no pain at the shoulder, performing at the height of their capacity, 87% were found to have rotator cuff tears, 90% were found to have labral tears, indicating that these tears simply occur. They're very slow in their progression. They're not acute in the majority of cases, so they simply exist, and the only reason they're found at the time you're having pain and the attempt to correlate them is because of the fact that you always get the MRI when you're in pain. If you had had the MRI when you weren't in pain, you still would have found the rotator cuff tear. They're very slow and progressive in nature. In most cases, when we're talking about the shoulder, it's actually a rotator cuff strain, which ends up limiting the rotator cuff's ability to keep the head of the arm bone below the shoulder bone, which sustains the space between the shoulder bone and the arm bone, preventing impingement of the bicep tendon, which is typically what becomes irritated and causes shoulder pain. So again, we're talking a muscular cause. Not structural, but muscular, would not show up on a diagnostic test. We could look at the hip region and you could have pain above the hip joint, and that would be the gluteus medius muscle straining. We could have pain running down the thigh, lateral thigh, near the hip joint. That's the iliotibial band, pain in the gluteal region. That is the piriformis. Rarely, if ever, in the over 2 decades of time I have been treating, have I found somebody who actually had pain associated with the hip joint itself, which most people don't even understand where it's located, so you really want to understand that, and that is to simply put your hands on what you would perceive as your hips, but it's really not your hips, it's the pelvic rim, and you would just run your hand down the side of the pelvis. You'd feel there's kind of a concavity, and then eventually you'd feel a little bony protuberance sticking out. That's your hip joint. So you would want to compress that joint, force the head of the thigh bone into the joint and see if you had pain. And I'm telling you now, in the majority of cases you won't. If you're slightly above it or below it, you might, and that's because you're either pressing on the gluteus medius muscle or the ITB band. Again, the majority of cases, muscle. And we could kind of go down the line. The elbow, the wrist, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that in the majority of cases, the cause is muscular. And yet, just appreciate this fact. The MRI is incapable of identifying any of these causes. So if you acknowledge that even in some small percentage, which is not true, it's actually 95 to 98%, but even if you're willing to accept the idea that it's only a small number of cases that muscular causes create symptoms, and these muscular causes can never show up on diagnostic tests, nor are there any medical specialists designed to identify these. Muscle seems to fall outside the realm of the medical world. What happens if that's the cause of your pain? A structural variation will be identified by the MRI. I think almost everyone is in agreement that if you seek medical attention for pain or some altered sensation, the natural progression is to get a diagnostic test, such as an MRI, and whatever shows up, whatever the structural variation is identified, that becomes the tissue that is identified as the one creating your symptoms. That is the tissue that is to be treated. So if we look at the back issue, let's say you have a muscle and spasm there, but You get an MRI, find stenosis or herniated disc. You're being treated for the stenosis or herniated disc. If you are having pain at the knee area and you're found to have that fallacy of being bone on bone, which really is just a representation of a decreased joint space, not actually being bone on bone. If you were bone on bone, you would have a major loss of range of motion. And at the point at which you could no longer go through range of motion, it would feel like a bone is hitting another bone, ergo bone on bone. In over 2 decades of time, I have found maybe 1 or 2 people who actually were bone on bone. Everybody else who was diagnosed as being bone on bone was not. They have full range of motion. And as a result of that, by definition, they could not be bone on bone. Again, a false premise and presentation created by a diagnostic test and a medical practitioner interpreting that diagnostic test. So, again, if someone's telling you you're bone on bone, and I've had thousands of people told they were bone on bone at the hip or knee, you will be recommended to get a joint replacement. When in fact, it could have been as simple as your front thigh muscles are stronger than your back thigh muscles, and that's what's leading to compression of the kneecap in the knee joint more than it should be, and as a result, that's what's leading to your pain. And all you would have needed was a little stretching of your front thigh muscle and strengthening of your hamstring to resolve the muscle imbalance, a muscular cause, creating that knee pain. Very sad, very sad. Thousands of people I've treated, scheduled for joint replacements, found to have muscular causes of their symptoms, saved, pain resolved, fully functional, saved from getting a surgery that would have only made their symptoms worse and led them to greater and greater levels of dysfunction. The shoulder, you're going to find a labral tear, you're going to find a rotator cuff tear, you're going to find arthritis. They're going to promote a surgery. In the vast majority of cases, the cause of shoulder pain is nothing more than a rotator cuff strain associated with other muscles responsible for stabilizing the shoulder blade or moving the shoulder joint, straining, and leading to, in most cases, impingement of the bicep tendon as it runs through the shoulder joint. It's a simple muscular cause. The problem is no diagnostic test to identify it, no specialist in a position to identify it or diagnose it either. As a result, if that's the cause of your symptoms, it will go along and along and along while some structural variation that's identified is treated. You have to appreciate this to be the fact. If you've had any experience in getting your symptoms treated through the medical system, you've had diagnostic tests, you know that whatever is found on that diagnostic test becomes the diagnosis that you will be treated based on. It's always structural, obviously, because muscular causes never show up. And you've gotten your treatments. You're still in the same level of pain, if not greater. You're constantly asking, well, why is that the case? And the medical practitioners you go to say, I don't know. We've done all the right things. The structures look fantastic. Think about the logic of what I'm saying. It's clear. The wrong tissue is being treated. It's a muscular cause, but that doesn't show up on a diagnostic test, and none of these specialists you're going to are in a position to identify that. I realize this is a very stunning thing to come to the realization of, but facts are facts. Now, if you want to have a theoretical basis why muscular causes are the case in 95 to 98% of cases, it's simply because of the fact that the reason you're having pain is because you're trying to work and live in a gravity environment. And as a result, gravity is creating a force against you. You have to work against that force. And if all the muscles aren't strong enough and capable of creating significant enough force to be able to work against the forces of gravity, the muscles are going to strain. They're going to elicit pain. Muscles work synergistically. One doesn't do the right thing, another one's going to break down. A muscle can strain and actually refers symptoms. Another fallacy. Oh, you're having what you perceive to be a referred neurological symptom. It turns out muscles refer symptoms just as much as nerves do, if actually greater, level through trigger points that exist in the muscle. But who's in a position to identify a muscle strain and having a trigger point in the muscle refer symptom? Nobody. Doesn't show up on a diagnostic test. No specialist in a position to identify it. There's so many causes. As I said, 95 to 98% of cases, I will tell you that the cause of your pain is a muscle straining and eliciting pain, a muscle straining and causing another muscle to compensate, that muscle eliciting pain, a muscle that strains and causes some sort of misalignment of joint surfaces, which leads to joint pain. Pain in a joint in almost all cases is muscular based. There's nothing structurally wrong with the joint that's eliciting that pain. It's muscles that attach to the joint, either being weak or imbalanced from straining, causing there be a misalignment of the joint surfaces, and that's why you get joint pain. You could have a muscle strain and refer symptoms. You could have numbness in your hand coming from a strain of a rotator cuff muscle, and through the trigger points in the rotator cuff muscle, it's causing symptoms in the hand. You could have a muscle strain and impinge on a nerve. That's what sciatica is. It has nothing to do with the spine. That's a lie. It's been a fallacy that's been around for too long. It's the piriformis muscle in the gluteal region straining and impinging on the sciatic nerve because another muscle in the hip region called the gluteus medius strains first, causing the piriformis to overwork and break down. Sciatica is actually associated with hip dysfunction. It has nothing to do with the spine. Muscular cause. Listen to all the potential causes that are muscular based that can never show up in a diagnostic test, and there's no medical specialist in a position to diagnose these. I figured this out over 2 decades ago when I went to medical school to become a physical therapist, and they were providing information that was clearly invalid. Because I was older, because I had a lifetime experience when I finally went to medical school of developing an analytical approach to taking in information, I saw it as what it was, invalid, and decided I was going to create my own method. That's what the Yass method is. The Yass method basically utilizes the way the body wants the proper tissue to be identified, which is an interpretation of the body's presentation of symptoms. Bone, muscle, or nerve will create very specific symptoms, very different symptoms. And the Yass method is in a position to understand through the interpretation of symptoms what tissue is creating those symptoms. The great part is all potential tissues, all potential causes can be identified through the interpretation of symptoms. So there's no hidden type of tissue that won't show up when being evaluated as there is with the MRI or with going to medical specialists who primarily depend on the MRI. You really have to appreciate that without that right diagnosis, you are on a very, very long path to chronic pain. And as I've said forever, in almost all cases, chronic pain is nothing more than misdiagnosed acute pain. You need the Yass method. If you want to get more information about the Yass method, you can go to my website at www.mitchellyass.com. You can contact me through email at drmitch@mitchellyass.com, drmitch at mitchellyass.com, or you can call me 516-449-1359. I have no problem about that. I'm here to answer your questions. Everyone has a right to have their pain resolved. There should no longer be chronic pain, and the Yass method is in a position to properly diagnose and treat the cause. If you're seeking medical attention, we can do it through Skype, or you can come to my office in St. Augustine, Florida. I really don't care how you get the information. I have my books out, Overpower Pain and the Pain Cure RX. Whatever it takes, get the information, get the Yass method. Whether it's for you, or maybe you have a friend, a family member, or a coworker, get the Yass method. It is your only path to a pain-free, fully functional life. It's time for you to reclaim your life. This is Dr. Mitchell Yass wishing you a pain-free, fully functional life. Bye-bye.